work, then you look at them in detail once or twice a year, then they go away in a drawer, and then you do the work and you check them every now and again. And if they work as they're intended to, if you fall out with each other, there's a way to resolve a dispute. If you've not got paid, then you can down tools and you'll be able to explain why and not end up getting sued by the client. It's an insurance policy. I mean, the problem with lawyers is we are emotional midgets who think we're the most important people in the room, and we never are. We overcharge sometimes and assume that the world owes us a living. I am a hugely frustrated creative. Wish I could do 1% of the work that my clients do. But that means that I'm very lucky that I can get passionate about this kind of stuff and passionate about keeping clients I work with around for years to come. And one of the facts behind that is to make sure you got the right agreements in place.
And I think, so from the perspective of coming previously running digital agencies and now working with agency leaders myself, I think one of the things that is the hardest part, I guess, is kind of realizing that you don't know what you don't know, and that's across many different areas of running a business. But realizing the true long-term impact of these sorts of things. Okay, a couple of clients, they're going to be problems, or you're going to have some kind of legal need or recourse over the course of running an agency. But just think, like you say, you want to get some funding or you want to sell. Someone's going to need to know that you've got clients in a retainer that are locked into the right levels without locking them in the negative sense. Now, I think there's quite a lot around that can be quite bewildering to some people, especially for me. I hate it. I hate massive sheets of paper. I hate loads of detail, and I think that quite a lot of creative-y type people who run digital agencies often end up looking at that and go, whoa, that's a load of boring text. It's probably fine leaving it at that. Yeah. So in today's webinar, we're going to go through quite a few bits and bobs, what's new, what's trending I say trending, mate, I'm sorry. What's trending in the legal sense of the word, not in the fun sense of the word. You won't find any of these hashtags on Twitter, I'm afraid, guys. Yet, what's trending? We're going to talk about something new to me, and I'll let you talk about that in a minute. The Assets 24 thing. Never heard of that turn of phrase, so really excited for you to talk all about that. We're going to talk about NDAs, we're going to talk about the value and the necessity of contracts and things like that. And I think along the way, I'm sure there'll be a few questions, and we can take those as we go, and we can see what shakes out. So, you happy to kick off, Steve, with essentially tell us what's trending, what's new?
Sorry, as a marketer, I'm not a bad lawyer. So when I say what's trending, there's a list. We're going to share some slides after the fact, and there's a list of stuff that I come across again and again and again. And some of them are fairly evergreen issues. Some of them have been identified and amplified by the pandemic. But what we're seeing, in the Northwest, we've got a real skills issue. So there are always going to be discussions around what agencies do to maintain a culture. Certainly when you may be bringing in big egos and big personalities, and all of a sudden it's not just three guys around a desk anymore. Skills and talent retention, again, we have a really big problem in Manchester with devs and the like walking across the street from one business to another for another £1,000. Yeah. We see an awful lot of agencies working with freelance resource because they need them, very often not getting them signed up to the right terms, on the understanding that which leads to issues that around the fact that they'll build something, we will think we can give that IP to our clients if that's what we want to do, but it turns out that we actually can't. There is loads of M&A going on, or at least there was a load of M&A going on. I think it's the gas.
I'm seeing a lot of conversation with other agency leaders at the minute around, team. They're calling it teaming up. So if you're talking about teaming up and you're listening to this right now, that's essentially an M&A.
Absolutely, yeah. And then there's a lot of consolidation. There's been talk about that for years and years. We've seen some bigger agencies look to fill in gaps in their value chain and filling gaps in their supply chain before now, and swallowed up a few smaller ones. Mediacom in Manchester was a really good example of that when they bought up Cheat and Bell and Co-Computer Love, and there's other ones around the country doing it. But I think part of the reason behind that is we're starting to see people at the top of agencies, maybe, and we'll get into this in a second when we talk about 24 assets, move away from working in the business to moving to working on the business, taking more of a strategic role, bringing somebody up to act as the new MD, and then figuring out what they want to do to prolong their own enjoyment. I was going to say prolong their own life, but that's a different webinar. To get out of just being on the tools every day, and then thinking about what's their exit route, where do they want to scale, where do they see this going for the course of the next 5 years. And we say to a lot of people who do that, okay, what are you going to do on day one after you've sold? Where do you go from there? What's going to keep you passionate? What's the next thing you're going to do? Contracts, there are always issues around contracts, because it is normally when a project goes wrong. Normally we see contracts that don't have the detail in that you would need them to. And I'm not talking about something that needs to be 50 pages long every time, but that just deals with the specifics, so that if there is a problem, you've got a way through it, and hopefully a way to recover that relationship. Debt recovery. If you are working with clients who are feeling the squeeze, where you might think you're on a 30-day payment run, they'll try and make it 60 or 90, or it'll be 30 days and then another 20, another 14 or whatever. So that's always an issue. The name of the podcast, we've also got an office dog. We've also now suddenly got a statements office. We want to find some unconverted mill and then convert it and stick neon all over the walls. Assume that that's going to create a culture, not necessarily, but property is always an issue, and it can be a bit more of a complicated conversation when you're going into that kind of building. Regulation, big issue. I'm not going to say, well, I'm going to have to say it now. GDPR is now the UK GDPR. The Advertising Standards Authority is very, very active and always has been, and they're getting a bit more interventionist in terms of campaign work. And then you've got privacy law changes coming down from the EU, and the fact that data protection is being reformed again, so it's going to look different than it was, when everybody thought that their agency was going to fall into the sea and everything had set on fire when GDPR came in. So there's lots of stuff going on. Some of it you see all the time. Some of it I think is a sign of the times. But a book that was introduced to me ages ago, and in fact an author that was introduced to me ages ago, was Daniel Priestley. Australian entrepreneur, and wrote a book called, and besides some others that I've read about agency life, 24 Assets really stuck out to me. He's written 4 or 5 books, but he talks about the assets that you need within your business to make it successful, to make it scalable, to make it sustainable. So we can run through the list. I'll run it as quickly as I can do. So content, in that once you create it, it costs nothing to protect. We'll get into that when we talk about IP later. Do you give it away too easily? Your methodology. Now, that's a really interesting discussion when you're in the agency world. Your methodology, what's that worth? How do you exploit it? How do you sell it? How do you retain it? If you want to earn it, you use it for other people. Your IP rights, whether that's registered or unregistered, again, we'll get to that. Your philosophy and your identity and your values. There's an awful lot of businesses doing an awful lot of work around that. But I think in the age of people wanting to know about the heart and soul of who they're doing business with, it's more relevant than it's ever been. Ambassadors. How do you reward them? How do you keep them engaged? Which ambassadors do you want to be going for? Your positioning. How do you get and how do you defend your foothold in the market? Channels. Which third-party channels are you using to tell your story? Can you develop your own? Which terms apply? Do you want to be using client work, for example, to help tell your story? And do your contracts allow you to do that? Because that's something that comes up again and again and again. We've done a great piece of work. We want to stick it into some creds, or we want to stick it into an awards entry. You look at the contract, you figure out, well, you can't share any details of anything you've done with us because of confidentiality wording.
Or you get into a situation where someone in the business says it's okay to do, it then goes live and it turns out that it wasn't okay to do. And I've seen that very recently, where a great case study goes live and within like half an hour it's immediately down and it's gone. It just disappeared into the ether. So always make sure that it's in the contract before you put it live.
No, exactly. And if you've transferred IP ownership to the client, that's theirs and not yours, and you can't share it without their permission. So not only is it potentially a breach of the confidentiality terms of your contract, it's an IP infringement as well. Data, what do you own? Do you really need it? Are you compliant? It's an asset, but it's an asset that you need to feed and water properly, and also be aware of the risk of it. If you're holding really old databases for real long periods of time without any good reason, then the chances are something's going to go wrong. Contact someone that doesn't expect to be. Next thing you know, someone's complained to the ICO. So that's much more of a risk than it used to be. Products. Now, what can you give away? What can you monetize? we are, for years and years and years, I've worked with agencies and had the discussion around, can you build something of your own that you can license, as opposed to just doing work that clients end up owning? That's, again, a pretty evergreen discussion, but we are seeing a lot of people moving towards that. Marketing, your operational systems, your culture. Again, how do you build a culture? Well, it's about how businesses look and feel, but also it's underpinned, believe it or not, through your contracts, through your policies and procedures, your vision, because that all helps to underpin your values and your strategy. How you recognize and reward key people of influence within the business. You may have some big personalities. They may have, for example, more followers on social than the business does. How do you make sure that you're leveraging the best out of them and they're getting the best out of you? And how do you keep them engaged in what you're looking to do? Your technical resource, how do you keep people in the business without walking across the street? Your business plan, because that helps you execute your vision. That's really, really important when you are looking to team up. When either someone you're looking to buy, someone looking to buy you, or an investor wants to know how you've got to get where you are and where you're going to go for the next 5 years, your business plan. Valuation, again, that's justified by your contracts, your products and your other assets, because it shows what you're worth. Your structure, because your structure is going to help you either scale or manage your way to growth, or ideally it will, are your founders all on board? Have you got the right people in decision-making positions in the business? And risk mitigation. So when there is a problem, this is where the dual legal stuff that you've spent a bit of time on in advance really comes into its own. And it's where the investment in that time and that expense really gets justified.
Yeah. So question on this. These, say, 24 assets, let's say that's like an entire shopping list of stuff to work on. Cool. You go through the list. Let's pretend that it is that simple. You go through the list, done it. Yeah. By the sounds of it, quite a lot of that stuff are things that you don't. It's not one and done. You don't start it and say, okay, completed the methodology. It's now an asset. You have to kind of own it, keep refining it, and presumably because a methodology is relatively woolly most of the time, it's not something that a methodology in digital marketing, digital agency land, becomes very out of date very quickly if something changes. But if something is like, if you're working on it as if it were a physical asset, is that, in my head I'm thinking that list of stuff, if you pretend that you're building something physical as a physical asset, those kind of slot into the same kind of thinking. If you're going to sell the agency or bring someone in or get investment or do an M&A, those are things that should be included in evaluation. Is that right?
Every single time. So when we get to talk about IP, it can be bought and sold just like a physical asset. Okay. And it needs to be defended. It needs to be developed to be worth what you expect it to be. Very often, as I say, it's a move away from working in the business to on the business. But I think anybody who just says, right, we've got it figured out now, before there's a change in, say, Facebook's policies that means we need to completely pivot the way we deal with whatever we do for clients on Facebook as a platform. It's hubris and it's dangerous. And I'm not suggesting that you should be looking at it every single day, but it absolutely is something that you need to feed and water. Otherwise, it's going to crumble. Otherwise, it's going to be obsolete. And we all know obsolete tech, obsolete methodology is really difficult to plug into somebody else's.
And the interesting so I feel like I'm pushing on this a little bit. So in the sense of, every time I've spoken to an agency owner around valuation or around the sale or the merger of their agency, we've gone through various rounds with various different potential buyers and things like that. And is it a case that potentially quite a lot of buyers on a lower end of the scale, I'm not talking like the media comms of the world, for example, because I know that they'll have a lot more experience, should we say, around these sorts of things. But when I'm seeing agencies of, say, 10, 15 people, rough size, being bought, very infrequently do you see that in the process of the valuation that those sorts of things are considered. So it's probably a really important thing if you're running a mid-ish sized agency and you're going through that early stages of a sale to speak to someone to try and value some of these assets that aren't physical, tangible in your hand.
Absolutely. I mean, your accountant, besides your lawyer, is one of the most important people to have on your speed dial. They're going to be able to tell you what the business is worth, at the very least theoretically, but where things get harder to value, and when you're talking about brand and culture and everything that comes behind it. Culture isn't something that you can, apart from the fact that you can show that people have stuck with the business for years and years. But IP is really difficult because you don't know what goodwill, say, is attached to a brand, apart from the fact that you can say the business has made this much money while this brand has been in place. It's really hard to put a number on halo effect. And it's really hard to put a number on, say, a product that you developed that you don't necessarily know the audience for just yet. More often than not, IP can be valued along the lines of potential. And there are really very few experts who'll be able to help you do that. There are ways to do it. There are some that your accountants can run through with you. But I think the danger as well is that if you are spending all your time spending all that money to get to a valuation, I think if you are working, then it becomes a bit of a monument to futility. If you at least are aware of the fact that you're building something that has a value and can get to a stage where you've got an idea of what that number is, at the very least roughly, then you'll know a bit where you are. You'll know a bit more about where you are. You'll know a bit more where you are in terms of your growth journey and whether or not you're ready to sell, whether or not you're looking to sell, and more importantly, what you may be worth to somebody else, or what your relative strength might be when you're having a discussion with somebody about whether or not you want to team up with them.
I could talk. I know I said at the very beginning of this that this is way beyond me and all that sort of stuff. I could talk about this for ages because it's a fascinating concept to try and put a value on something which is technically intangible, and also you're talking about something in the future. Absolutely brilliant. But you must remember the first rule of Fight Club. Let's talk a bit about NDAs, because I've almost every engagement has one. Whether it be in the final contract or whether it be during the discovery phase or anything like that. And I don't think there's ever a time where they're probably more needed than from a digital agency perspective in many senses, because there's a lot of IP, but you kind of have to, if you're pitching for a project, you have to see clients' data, get access to their stuff, but also you have to show what you do, and that's kind of open the book, show your methodology, and I always found that piece, it's if you're pitching to people who know that, then they've been through this dance before, then they're usually fine. But early doors, getting the right way of doing it. I know there's different versions of NDAs and things like that, so it'd be really good to kind of unpick that a bit.
No, of course. So it's more often than not now, it is the first step in a discussion. You will be talking to a really exciting client. They will be convinced that they're about to disclose information to you that if it gets out into the wider world, then the earth will fall in on itself. But equally, they are coming to you for advice and because they see potential value in what you do. So there's a real exchange. Businesses that you are looking to partner with, or clients that you're looking to work for, will probably say, well, we're taking the bigger risk because we're exposing what could be pretty business critical information to you. We don't know you that well, and we need to know that you take care of it, which works if you're acting for the clients. But as I say, they are coming to you for advice, and what they'll get from the beginning, what's going to impress them is going to be your creativity, are going to be the ideas you come up with. And if, say, you are disclosing mock-ups or wireframes or first drafts of content, even software, anything else like that, that's all protectable as a separate IP right. Most of that is protectable by copyright, potentially by passing off by trademarks as well. But if it's just information that has a value but doesn't easily fit into a basket, it becomes confidential information. Confidential information is only protectable legally where it has some kind of commercial value and what they call the quality of confidence, and where it's disclosed to somebody else in a situation that suggests that there should be an obligation of confidence. Now, that can sometimes be really obvious from the context to something. But the reason you send NDAs and receive them is so that you've got all of the obligations that you need from the other side in terms of confidentiality in one place. And then if you end up falling out with each other, you can say, well, this obviously was confidential. Even if you don't sign their NDA or they don't sign yours, sending that alone is normally going to be enough to show that you've got confidential information that can be protected. And within that document is going to be something called the purpose. That's going to say, this is the reason why I'm disclosing or receiving confidential information from you. You make any use of that beyond that purpose, then potentially we can sue you.
And I presume in the professional sense, even though, like you say, one might not be signed, even if one isn't necessarily sent immediately, there's still going to be a bit of an exchange. And there's a kind of an implicit understanding that you're going down a path which would normally include one of these kinds of agreements. And if you then get to the last hurdle of a contract or the last hurdle of onboarding a client and it all falls through, you are kind of bound by it? Or would it be harder to fight or argue? Or
well, I mean, if the idea would be you've got your NDA, if you then enter into a further agreement with the client where you're actually going to do some work with them over a period of time, you've won the work, you've won the pitch, then that NDA will normally fall away and there'll be confidentiality wording in the new agreement. This is for the gap between that first conversation, meeting the hotel bar and then leaving for a bedroom somewhere in the crudest terms possible. And it sets the tone. I think as well, it sets the tone in terms of confidentiality, but I think it does in professionalism as well. If you are saying to clients that you're talking to, say if you would send them your NDA first, you are telling them that you're going to give them something of value. And I think it helps to set ground rules from a really, really early stage.
So, quick question that's come up on Twitter from Charlie. Hello, Charlie.
Hey, Charlie.
How enforceable are they? Let's say I took a pitch from your agency. You gave me a roadmap of how you were going to deliver something. You said it was kind of like your secret sauce, why you're such a good agency. Then I said, no, thanks. But I took the pitch, took the strategy that you did, and then brought it in-house anyway. What have I got in my arsenal to enforce it, or likewise the opposite way around?
Well, you've got an audit trail to show what you sent and under what terms. Confidential information cases are pretty rare. The thing about getting an NDA signed, if you can do, is that if somebody uses the information or whatever you exchange between each other for something outside the purpose that I mentioned earlier, and that causes a loss, you've lost an amount of money, then that's a breach of contract as well as misuse of confidential information. And it is kind of the same discussion around how enforceable are contracts. Sometimes, very sadly, the answer to that question is it depends upon the budget you've got to pursue them. And it depends on what you want that relationship to be going forward. But it is at the very least a foundation. It is at the very, very least an opportunity to be able to have that fight, as opposed to just, know that all the work you've done in selecting a client that is going to be good for you to pitch for, where you've sense checked whether or not this is worth your time, knowing that the pitch in and of itself is probably going to be about as much work as any other small project would be, knowing that you're going to get some kind of return out of that, and knowing that this is not just an excuse for a client to get you in, take your ideas, then hand them off to someone else within their roster.
So I'm guessing, and this will almost be a really, hopefully yes, no answer. So let's say we're going through a process. I then leave the company that you're pitching to, but I'm bound by an NDA with my own contract that I have as from an employee point of view. Whose NDA have I breached, or both?
Potentially both. So you will have a duty of confidentiality to your employer if you're an employee. Your employment contract will have confidentiality wording in it anyway. And within the NDA between the business and the client, that will cover what happens if employees breach the NDA as opposed to the business as a whole. So say somebody leaves a load of pitch information that can, or client data, that kind of thing. In the first instance, it's the business's problem, but then the business would come after whoever's left to try and contain the issue and to try and enforce the terms of their employment contract. And it's not just NDA confidentiality.
This is how you lawyers make so much money, because there's like 4. I'm just counting in my head. There's like 4 different lawyers there at one point.
Well, I hope not. I mean, no, but it's the thing about confidential information in particular is once it's out, it's out. Once it loses the quality of confidence, then it's a depreciation asset that you won't want to spend money on trying to protect. Whereas, as opposed to if you're creating content, copyright comes into existence the moment that you record an idea in a permanent form that's original, and you are protected for a certain amount of time automatically. You don't need to go away and register or anything else like that. Once confidential information is out to the wider world, normally confidentiality cases tend to revolve around injunctions where a business is trying to stop that information getting out and to get an order restraining somebody from sharing it. It's pretty rare that anyone will then try and spend money trying to put the genie back into the bottle. But if you've got a wider dispute between 2 businesses, it becomes a pretty important topic of discussion. Got
it. And it sort of neatly brings us into the next part of this conversation. And you may well have seen, I know you definitely saw, Steve, there was a Twitter thread a couple of weeks ago where, won't name them just in case I have to speak to Steve's counterpart, but they were essentially suggesting that contracts are only in existence to lock people into something because you're not good enough to keep them as a client. And the only reason you would have a contract is because you've managed to dupe them into signing up, and therefore you keep them for a year. Now, my feeling on this is that, having experienced 2 different digital agencies with several different layers around how and where contracts go, contracts are absolutely essential, and having the right contract is really important. Not having a contract at all suggests that there's not an NDA, but there's also not a common thread of promises that even down to payment terms and things like that. Yeah. So don't let anyone tell you they don't matter is my bit of advice. I know that there's a lot to balance in them as well, especially in a digital age. So what's your kind of take and advice on from a contracts perspective?
Well, that what you described, the Twitter thread, sounds like a manifesto for good account management. Good account management is great. When that fails, you will need a roadmap for what happens as and when you fall out. And the point behind the contract is, if you're in business, it's presumed that you're in a contract. If you have the elements of a contract, so you've got an offer to provide services, an acceptance, an intention to create legal relations, there's some kind of consideration, there's payment or a reciprocal obligation passed between the 2 of you, and the certainty of terms, then you're in a contract. And the cases say, and I think I've got all the elements of the contract there, but they're in the slides just in case I missed one. I should know them. I've not had enough coffee today. But the basic terms of any kind of contract, even if you don't have one that's in writing, there we go. 4th level, 5th. I was going to say, I thought that was me putting in some kind of Zen guide there for a moment, but there we are. It's the point about them is the general position is fair day's work, fair day's pay. You do some work, you get paid for it. All right. Well, what about scope creep? What happens when a client says to you, okay, we really like this, can you just add this to the contract? And you say, well, hold on a minute, the original agreement doesn't provide for that. So how do we know we're going to get paid for it? Where's that in writing? What do you do about your metrics? How is success measured? Are we talking about, say, your normal SEO kind of metrics? Are you talking about paid social? Is it just views? Is it shares? Whatever else? Where it gets really interesting, what about your actual obligations? What does the client expect from you? If you haven't got that set out in a contract of your own, then it's to use reasonable skill and care to do the job properly. But do they need you to comply with their policies? Do they need you to work in a particular way? And the flip side of that is, what do you need from the client? You need them to cooperate with you. You need them to give you access to their systems if you need it. You need them to give their access to your people and their information. You need them to come back to you and give you sign off within a reasonable amount of time. Otherwise, you can't complete a project as they expect you to, or you can't hit the marks you say you're going to hit. interestingly, what happens if you're down tools? So if you haven't been paid, you're 6 months into a 12-month contract, client isn't paying you, you threaten to walk away, and they say, well, hold on a minute, you're tied into a 12-month agreement, that's going to be a breach of contract. And potentially it could be. The way around that is to have a term in your agreement that says if we're not paid for a certain amount of time, then we are able to down tools, and that's set out in the contract itself. More fundamentally,
that's something that will become probably more of a requirement in terms of being aware of this. If you're thinking about your contracts right now, have a look at your contracts to make sure that they've got those sorts of clauses in, because sadly, with money being tighter across most of the world right now, there are going to be instances where clients with all the best interest in the world probably can't pay or pay on time, and being a good person about it and having some flexibility is important, but you need to protect your own business. And you know, the OMG Centre is in the business of helping agencies run their business, and it would be really bad to see that kind of flexibility then turning into cash flow problems for you, the agency owner. So make sure that you've got that flexibility available, but have it contracted that there's a hard line, you know, X amount of time means this, because that will protect you. And it's kind of both sides of the coin there. One thing I've noticed in the last few years actually is quite a lot of digital agency contracts have moved away from results to deliverables. So it'll be something like on the first week of the month, you will have a report which includes these bits of data. You will also receive X amount of Y things, instead of previously it was we'll increase your traffic by 25% year over year or something like that, because that's super hard to do. Super hard to promise. And very hard to deliver if things don't go well externally to what you're delivering.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But at least if you get those reports, you've got something tangible, as opposed to, you know, like you say, we're gonna get you 25. Well, we're gonna increase sales by 25% through SEO or PPC, something like that. You know,
it's so hard to prove.
No, it is, and the way you can have analytics reports all day long that will try and help you make that case. But equally, I think some of the bigger clients will expect that kind of reporting now, because they will be far less willing to give you 3 or 4 months to get to a point where you've uplifted traffic. They will want to know what you're doing in the meantime. They'll want to get into the granularity of it so that they can show, even if, you know, say after 3 months, if you needed them to be in a relationship for 6 to 9 months to get the full value, or to understand the full value of what you do, to see a real impact, then you've at least got something to back up the work that you've done. And the only other way to do that would be through, you know, timesheets, other kinds of MI. But certainly when you're working with bigger clients, they will expect that now. And as you say, it's if a brand, the worth of a brand is hard to value unless you're Disney or Apple or Samsung, your place in that is sometimes difficult to justify. So at the very least, if you can show that you're working and you're providing that service, then it seems dull. It's not the secret sauce, but it's the kind of thing that is going to help to get you paid.
Yeah, and this is, it goes both ways. Obviously, you want to produce what you're selling to clients, because that's how you keep in business. You get more referrals and things like that. One thing which I feel like I bang on about an awful lot. So one of the things I do with a lot of agency leaders is help build a plan for growth. Part of that plan is their marketing and their sales funnel and everything along those lines. Now, one of the things that irks me hugely is these incredibly lengthy, massively fastidious contracts that are they are covering every base that could possibly ever happen under the sun, 20 pages long, and only one page where there's a signature kind of thing. And the only bits that are ever changed in it is the company name, the service deliverables, the price, and the date. And I notice when a contract is much better written, and not just shorter, but much better written, so that it's so easy to understand what you're agreeing to, the conversion rate at that final hurdle is significantly higher. So you've gone to all that effort to market to get leads in, to then do a huge amount of effort to pitch and go through the lovely, hand-holding phase and get the sale, to lose it because you've given someone something which has been essentially downloaded and Frankensteined off the internet.
Yeah.
Where's the balance, do you think? What is the right balance?
Well, you see, I think a lot of this sometimes comes down to growing up in public. You may be working in an agency that's had a 5-page agreement that has worked for years and years and years. And then all of a sudden you get big pharma client that walks in through the door and expects more detail. And this has happened to loads of my clients plenty of times, and they give you a 100-page contract. And you realize that there are just big gaps in terms of what you cover and in the agreements itself. And I think part of the issue is that the way you provide services and the way results are measured, we just talked about it then, can be really different across different service lines you provide. So, for example, what will look like a good result in an SEO agreement or a PPC agreement or a paid social agreement, any other kind of paid media, is going to be measured very differently from acceptance testing on building a website or an app. How do you get to a point where the client is happy in either can be very different. And if you really want to offer all of those services in one document, then that's where contracts do get lengthy. But a lot of what you see in them is boilerplate stuff, common wording that you see every single time. But not every contract needs to be that long. You can do this kind of thing through terms and conditions. You can have, say, an order form, a project proposal, tie it into a project plan, so that you've got more detail around how this is going to work commercially and creatively. Contracts at the end of the day do not need to be in writing. They can be oral, and they do not need to be in one document. They can be an email. But the problem is, where you start to have problems is that you have to sift through all those previous conversations to get to the meat of what's really, really, really
right. And sometimes this balance needs to be struck, like where you have lots and lots of wording that's relatively boilerplate, but you also need to make sure that anything you've actually promised is either included in it or has been excluded from it, depending on where that conversation went. I've been in meetings this week with an agency who they're in a bit of a pickle at the minute, probably end up talking to you at some point, where they promised things in meetings face to face, and it's then kind of been forgotten to add to these statement of work, which is an underpinning factor of the contract. Now they're delivering what's in their statement of work because the owner has gone in and done the pitching and all of the agreements and all the blah blah blah, and the delivery has been passed on to someone else who's got a statement of work which doesn't match what all the promises are. And the balance that isn't met is usually then because, sadly, the human has caused the problem, not just the sales process or the contract being 10,000 pages. And I guess, is it reasonable then to say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth because I might be totally wrong here, have versions of your contract which are, I'm working with an SME who's on a £3,000 a month contract versus I'm working with Big Pharma on a £30,000 a month contract, because I'm putting myself into the small client's perspective. If I get a 20-page contract, I'm going to start thinking, hang on a minute, what are they trying to get one over on me or something? Yeah. Whereas big company is going to think the exact same thing, but the opposite way around if the contract's too small.
Big companies are going to demand the length of contract from you anyway, and more often they're going to try and give you theirs.
Yeah.
What the situation you described before can actually be sorted out through, and that's a really good example of where a contract can work for you. So one of the boilerplate clauses that I mentioned earlier in a contract is something called the entire agreement, which says that whatever discussions we've had previously, whatever presentations you've had, whatever else, whatever marketing material you've had, anything in email, everything we've talked about does not count. Only what is in this agreement and this statement of work does. So in that kind of situation, that's your fallback. And if they've signed up to something that has that in, then they might have a bit of an ethical or a moral argument, but a legal one is a little bit different.
So with that in mind, though, sorry to how does that become a breach? How do you get into the stage where I've agreed something in a face-to-face meeting. It's not written down. There's no meeting minutes, but I know I've been promised this thing. I'm now saying I don't recall any of this conversation, and it's not in the scope of work. Is that talk to me? What is a breach of contract, first of all?
Well,
and how do you prove it?
Well, so just one point, if I can, on the 20 pages long thing. In a perfect world, you would have what's called a framework agreement for most clients, or a set of T's and C's, where you onboard them, you deal with all the contractual stuff once, and then the rest of your time and your energy is spent working on statements of work. Because you've onboarded them, it feels a bit more corporate than otherwise it would be, but that's a way to do it, so that you can then spend your time working on the actual project itself. You end up in breach of a contract when you don't stick to the terms of one, basically, when you fail to perform your obligations in accordance with the terms. Now, not every breach is catastrophic. Some are minor, some can be put right, and an awful lot of contracts, pretty much every contract I draft will say, if there is a problem, then you need to tell us, and we get 28 days to try and put it right, or longer if you can arrange for that. You'll be put on notice, and then you will come up with a way of solving the problem. Some breaches are a bit more serious than that. They're what's called material and can justify the termination of the agreement in certain circumstances. And some are what they call repudiatory, which is where you've got a breach that goes right to the heart of your relationship and allows you to walk away from the whole thing. Now, if you are in breach, or what do you get if you're in breach? You get damages, if you were to go all the way to the court and win, that put you back in the position you'd been in had the breach not taken place. You will normally get interest on top of that sum. You can specify that rate of interest within your agreement. More often than not, it's tied to a percentage above base rate of whatever bank you use. If you win in court, of course, you will end up with getting your legal costs back if you're the winner, or at least 60 to 70% of them. You never make money on litigation. And unfortunately, that's never money.
Sorry.
You don't? Well, sorry. Okay. Lawyers do.
Yeah, there we go.
None of the parties in litigation make money on litigation, apart from very, very rare circumstances. Now, if, of course, you then end up with a claim that's worth less than £10,000, then you're in the small claims track at court, which means that you can't recover your legal costs from the other side, and they can't recover it from you. And you should be able to deal with this dispute yourself. And a lot of contracts may fall below that. And certainly things like money claim online have made it a lot easier to pursue claims than otherwise. But it's important to remember, you're not just talking about legal costs when you're in dispute or you're in breach. There's management time that goes along with that. And there's the emotional investment that you put into it as well. Yeah. And management time is very, very difficult to recover. More importantly, if you're in an agreement and someone says you're in breach at a certain point, it can be really hard to get that relationship back on track, but it's not impossible.
I think something that's popped into my head just now, and maybe this is harder to kind of stomach. If you're running an agency, you really want the sale, but your gut says something's not going to go right. I would caution against getting that contract signed and trying to work out whether or not it actually will work out, because it's probably, based on all the stuff you're saying in terms of costs and time and everything, it's probably quite expensive to deal with a dispute. And it's probably more painful if you kind of felt like it might have not gone so well before you start.
No, absolutely. And say you're working with a foreign client that you would then have to pursue in their home country, even though you can say a contract's subject to UK law, UK courts, UK jurisdiction. And I've seen it happen with clients where you will be working for what looks like a really, really good entrance into the UK market that then cynically just stick to the minimum term of their contract, or they'll decide they don't like you and serve notice of termination on day one, and you only get 3 months instead of 12.
Yeah, I'm working with an agency right now where that exact thing has happened. They during the pitching process, the potential client said, "Hey, we just want the strategy. We want to do it on our own." And the guy was like, "No, it's not the pitch. This is what it is." They actually sold it and agreed to the 12-month term. Day one, handed in the notice, which coincided with the delivery date of the strategy. And there's nothing they can do. And they put all this effort and time and energy and money into it. And it's cross-jurisdictional as well. So it's going to take even more time to go and get that money from the other, I can't remember where else it was from, but, and this has just coincided perfectly with a question from Aaron. which is how many agencies that you work with, Steve, actually have figured any of this, figured it all out? Because there's the assets thing, which is really, really important. And that's a long-term on the business. You've got to think about it. You've got to really dedicate time and effort into protecting it, but also building it. Then you've got NDAs and making sure they're the right thing. And you've got the right type of contract, the right length of contract. You've got all the terms in the contract, the length of the contract, the short. And then you've got to think about all these painful things that could go wrong as well. How many agencies have got this right?
There's plenty that realise they need to get it right, but find the process of getting there really painful. That will have contracts drafted that work for them, and then when the big shiny client walks in that promises them the world, they're willing to ditch their own terms of work to the clients. I think what we saw in COVID was not so much businesses going to the wall, but projects getting cancelled, and then all of a sudden a great number of agency owners saying, right, okay, now is the time to try and get this figured out. But I would not assume that the people watching this webinar are in the minority, that they haven't got this exactly where they need to be. There's a saying in data protection, because everybody loves a good data protection anecdote, right? There's a saying that you will never get to 100% compliance, because you won't. Business changes, law changes, life changes, and you need to keep pace with that as best you can. I think there's a much more understanding now that it is worth spending time on, but I think getting from the start of that exercise to the end of it can be a little bit different when you're willing to put some time aside to start the process, and then a job comes in and that job has your attention, has your passion, and suddenly the stuff that you've thought is really important for the bedrock of your business is just something that you get to between projects. Lawyers will always say marketing's what happens between actual work, and agency owners will say the other way around. Legal is what happens between actual marketing.
So the getting it right bit is super hard without and I'm not trying to plug your services, except I am. It's really hard. It's really hard to get anything right that you don't fully understand. Knowing that you need to work on it is absolutely something that you can work out without some advice. There's a lot of kind of gung-ho attitude in digital marketing, digital agency space. But as a business grows, you start to realize what you need to protect. And I think the second you have that scratch in the back of your head that says, I've got to keep an eye on this, I've got to protect the people that I employ, I've got to protect the people I work for, I've got to protect the stuff I'm building. All this time I'm putting in an energy and money. As soon as you start to question that, that's when genuinely, like you said, you've got your accountant on speed dial, get a lawyer that you can have on speed dial, because I think even if it's a case of like, okay, I've not updated my contracts for the last year or two, do I need to? I have no idea. Do I need, I've got an NDA that's 4 years old, and I've just started a new engagement with the same company and they've come back. Do I need a new NDA? Is it still valid? That stuff, you can Google that, but you're looking at an internet full of misinformation, as we all know. So get someone who really knows what they're talking about, and good advice costs money. And similarly with an accountant, you get what you pay for back in spades in the long term, because what an accountant will save you in mistakes, a lawyer will also save you in the same regard. And it's the same again with HR, and we're having a webinar about along HR in a couple of months' time. And the legal side of HR is incredibly complex now, especially in a world where people work from home, there's cross-jurisdictional remote work and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. Getting it right is super, super hard. Knowing that it's right is impossible. And even the best lawyer in the world will always defer to reading and working it out themselves, right? So, I engage you, Steve, and I engage your business. We have a conversation, and in 6 months' time, I ask you a question you don't know the answer to. You're not going to do the SEO answer, which is it depends. You're going to say it depends, and I'll come back in a week with a bunch of bits of information for you.
Yeah, well, and it has to be, because if we're not spending time thinking about it, there'll be some stuff that you know from experience.
Yeah,
and that's where you can really add value. And yeah, pay a lawyer, if it's not me, whoever it is, pay a lawyer, because you're then going to get that advice. But they've got to add value. You know, if it's someone that knows your business, that's taking the time to get to know your business and knows your sector, then that value is going to be, you know, multiple times what you're paying in terms of actually getting the documents drafted themselves. It needs to be someone who has an interest in who you are and what you do, who is invested in it more than others might be, because they need to be about as passionate about your business as you are, if that's at all possible. And it's, you know, where I've been really lucky is to have seen things go really right for clients and seen things go really wrong for clients. And if you've got that shared experience, so you can get to base camp pretty quickly on what you need to do, you shouldn't need to do the discovery piece as a lawyer. You know, you'll need to get the facts of the issue in front of you, but you'll know the background, you'll know the kind of business you're dealing with, you'll know what their appetite for risk is, you'll have an idea about the sector in which they operate, and you get way better value for money that way.
Speaking of value for money, thank you for coming on. Everyone who's listening in the future, hello future people. This could have been a 4-hour webinar or an entire day, or probably even longer, because I'm pretty sure it took you longer than a day to learn all of this stuff. There's so much on this that is not just about right now. It's about protecting what you've already done and protecting what you're gonna do. It's about protecting the people you employ, because let's face it, in the nicest possible way, I'm going to say it sound like, you're employing people, you're paying them money, you expect a return on your investment from them, which is then to deliver good work, contract supply to delivery of work from clients and staff and things like that. But equally, you're paying those people's mortgages or feeding their families by the salaries that you're paying them for the work that they're doing. If they're working their asses off, don't make them go on the breadline or to the food bank or to not have their heating on because you didn't get the right contracts and you lost the clients because you did something that's entirely more or less mitigable. Not that that's a proper word.
It is now.
It is now coined. So thank you very much for coming along, Steve. Our next webinar on the 26th of January is going to be with Nabil and Ollie, where they are from a Web3 organization that helps train businesses around Web3 for in the digital business phase. There's just like with ChatGPT and with most legal stuff and most of Twitter, no one knows what the hell's going on. These guys have distilled it into something which helps agencies to understand whether there's a route for them to take, and similarly to how when social media became a new thing, kind of understand which bits to put effort into and which bits to avoid. So I think, and again, I think from a legal point of view, Steve, you've probably had your fair share already of conversations around Web3 and what the heck's going on with all of that, because it's the Wild West right now, similarly how SEO was 10, 15 plus years ago. Want to buy a OMG NFT, Steve?
Not right now, just the same way as I wouldn't buy a Donald Trump digital trading card, but that's a different discussion.
Another webinar for that one.
Yeah,
Thanks so much for coming along, Steve. It's been brilliant having you here.
No, and thanks very much, Chris. And I must apologise. Occasionally my light has dimmed because I'm in a building that thinks it's clever where the lights go out. So if I've been waving around, it's not because I've got some kind of condition, just so you know.
But you do have a different condition, another webinar, different webinar. We can talk about that one.
Indeed so.
Thanks so much. Speak
Thanks,
to you all later, and give Steve a call if you can.
Thanks very much, guys.